So recognizing this morning's so-called news, what I would like to do is just ask Gavin to say a few words regarding, this is Mr. Wong talking about Mr. Wright in some sense. If I do, bad joke. Keep it up. So just to recognize that, because there will be some time, but I don't want that to overshadow the panel because we do have business to discuss. So Gavin, could you just say a few words about this morning's article?
Sure. I'll first say I was not hacked. The blog post that I posted this morning at gavinandreessen.ninja is indeed my words. I still believe that Craig Wright is, beyond a reasonable doubt in my head, Satoshi Nakamoto. I can talk more about why I believe that if there are questions in the Q&A session, and I'm imagining there will be. But let's save that for the Q&A and talk about the technology and governance.
Great. So in some sense, this news article broke this morning, and as a public peer-to-peer protocol, in some sense, there was a peer review already on Reddit, in some sense, talking about why Mr. Wright is, again, may not be Satoshi Nakamoto. But that gives you an example of the power of an open process, an open peer-to-peer process. And this is an open protocol. And we're here to discuss mainly issues to do with scaling on how do we reach consensus on open blockchains. But peer review is not exactly new. We've had it, I think, for several hundred years, at least in the academic sphere, with peer review papers. And so what I'd like to do, one of the key aspects of scaling this technology is where are the engineers, where are the people who are going to be trained in these crypto protocols, where are they actually going to come from? What we also know is that this is crypto protocols. Crypto is, I think what we've learned over the last year, is that nuance doesn't scale. It's very difficult to articulate why these open protocols are constructed the way they are, why scaling them is in fact technically quite a nuanced discussion. So from the academic perspective, we have the MIT DCI, one of the contributors to Consensus 2016. It's been now just over a year that they've been formed, I think last April in 2016. So we're very privileged to have Neha, and I hope she can share with us a few views as the technical director there on, I guess, what the DCI is looking at in terms of scaling the human resource side.
Sure. So hi, everyone. It's very nice to meet you. I think I'm relatively new to this community. I just started in Bitcoin about 5 or 6 months ago, though I have a background in computer science. And I think what's really exciting about cryptocurrencies and this technology right now is it's slowly becoming a legitimate academic discipline. And that's really amazing because it pulls from so many different areas. There's computer science, there's game theory, there's networking security, there's cryptography, there's financial models. And we didn't really have the vocabulary in the system for putting all of these different areas together and figuring out how to do peer review and how to do real research. And we're starting to figure it out. And so I think this is going to be a really exciting next couple of years as the academic communities come together and are formed and work with everyone in industry as well. And we start to get a really good framework and structure for figuring out how to tackle these really challenging problems.
Right. And over the last year, there's been, again, we're moving from pilot to production. I think in March this year, Ethereum, you basically gone live and launched, and right now you're number 2, I think, in the overall market cap. Could you share with us what do you feel are different about open blockchain technologies from, say, traditional databases, or what's unique about this area, at least in your experience?
I mean, I've found that open blockchains in general are this very unique kind of environment in that they're not like any kind of traditional like corporation, country, software system because there is no one group that very clearly controls it. And particularly becomes interesting because the group that or the mechanism that actually controls it is often to a very large degree kind of unspecified. So it's, there's no sort of consensus that, this is the mechanism, by which some new feature can get adopted, the protocol might change. And instead, it's this kind of interesting game where people have to sort of just get consensus on a purely social level. It's like, the one analogy you might use is imagine if, let's say, the English language had a, let's say, English Core Development Institute, and that development institute would might try to launch new words from time to time, or decide, that S you have to add on top of after verbs if you use them in the third person is stupid, let's remove that. And then let's say you might even imagine some, let's say Classical English Development Institute that started launching its own changes, and let's say these two started disagreeing with each other. So it's the point is that there's no odd way that we all agree on in which it would move forward.
So this whole notion of consensus is I guess very frustrating for the business community because it's like, well, who's in charge?
Yeah.
And you're sometimes presented as a figurehead, obviously
Right.
because of your invention with Ethereum. But then similarly within Bitcoin, again, one of the people, a lot of things that it's open source, right? It's you can fork the code, but whether or not the code gets accepted or pushed out into the production environment is by choice of those who download it. And so, what is the difference between, say, open source and open blockchains? Are they comparable?
And to some degree, I would argue that blockchains are kind of a continuation of open source. So what I mean by that is if you look at especially the original free software movement with Richard Stallman, one of the things that he specifically in his presentations always talks about is just how valuable it is for a person to be actually in control of the code that they're running. Now, the whole concept of free software movement started off in the 1980s, where most computing was done back basically on a computer and it stayed on your computer. But then in the 2000s, what happened is we moved to a large extent to cloud computing. And arguably, cloud computing is even worse than proprietary software like Windows, because if you're running Windows and if it's on your computer, at the very least you can reverse engineer it. If it's on the cloud, you have no idea what's happening.
Right.
And people are potentially interested in blockchains as a kind of open source counterparts to that.
And some have argued that blockchains are going to be the new operating system for these new clouds. And so even within the Bitcoin space, we've seen since last year we've had we've had XT, we have Classic, we now have Core as examples within one space. What are the differences between the two? And Eric, could you speak to what is this Bitcoin Core that I keep hearing about?
Yeah, so Bitcoin Core is the open source software project that builds the backbone of the Bitcoin network. It also has been kind of like the home to where the protocol definition is made, because a lot of the definition itself is in the code. It's really hard to document a lot of these rules in a way where we know for sure that every single node is going to be running exactly the same rules. So it's kind of become a reference implementation of that. One of the things we'd really like to do is to be able to separate the consensus rule definitions and have multiple implementations that can offer different approaches and maybe different programming languages to implement these nodes. But one of the things about consensus networks that it goes far and beyond most other software projects is this kind of requirement for compatibility. There really is very little tolerance as far as if two different nodes disagree on some basic rules, they can be forked onto different networks. So one of the big things that we've been really trying to do with Bitcoin Core is find ways that we can have a decentralized process for deploying new consensus rule changes. And the biggest thing we've been trying to focus on is compatibility. How are we able to deploy new features in a way that doesn't break old nodes off the network? So, like for instance, with the whole SegWit thing, the segregated witness, this has been basically the biggest protocol improvement that's been done to Bitcoin since the beginning. And part of that is allowing for extensibility, so allowing you to commit other kinds of data into the blockchain in a way that allows for better cryptographic proofs. What this means is that you can add new features to the protocol in a way where old nodes will not check those new validity rules, but they will still consider those blocks valid. So that's part of what we're trying to do, is because really we really have no way of specifying exactly what software every node on the network should run. People run whatever software they want, and we can make recommendations, and that's what we try to do. But in the end, we want to really try to preserve this compatibility, and so that's been kind of like the biggest focus of it.
Gavin, how many nodes now on the Bitcoin network approximately?
Last I checked, there were 6,000, 7,000, depending on the time of
7,000
day.
nodes. So these 7,000 people who run these nodes just download the software that they want to run
And,
Right.
they're actually not all running the same software.
Right.
And there's definitely a tension between compatibility and diversity.
Okay.
Diversity in a network is great if you can get it and maintain compatibility, right? It's a great thing that there's a diversity of web browsers we can choose from. It's a great
Sure.
thing that sort of diversity of companies producing Ethernet equipment that speaks the Ethernet protocol. I completely agree with Eric. We need to get more serious about the protocol definition and trying to really nail down this is the Bitcoin protocol.
One thing I failed to understand, though, I mean, consensus protocols, at least computer science, have been around for a while. I don't quite understand why blockchain consensus protocols are so, I guess, not well understood mathematically. I mean, Neha, do you have any?
Yeah, definitely. So it's actually quite frustrating to hear the consensus thrown around. It has so many different meanings, and in computer science and distributed algorithms in particular, it has a very specific meaning. It's about a group of servers coming to agreement on a single value. And so it's really interesting to hear the word used in so many different ways. I think what's really novel about what's happening right now, consensus algorithms, by the way, are over 30 years old. So we've had the ability to run algorithms like this since the early 80s. But what's really novel right now is this open access model. That is something that people didn't really look at, and in particular, using rationality, using a currency to secure an open admissions, open access consensus protocol. So that's what's really brand new. That's what's happening right now. And I think that's what's really exciting about the space that we're moving into, is that we're entering a stage where we can have this open, interoperable protocol, which anyone can play with. And when we have this kind of a model, when we have this kind of a platform, it spurs all kinds of innovation.
And this open interactive model, this morning we heard at least a reference to Mark Andreessen and how he viewed, at least a few years ago, that we're 2 years away from this sort of this boom. And if we compare this point about diversity with the internet, back, there's a distributed database called the DNS. And there was a time that there was one software implementation which had 100% market share, which was called Bind, the Berkeley Internet Name Daemon. And it was viewed then that, that's not healthy. Why? Because if there's one implementation and there's something that goes wrong with it, then you might have a systemic failure. But what's interesting right now, and Eric, the point that you made about the code is in some sense a spec, are we ever going to get to the level where we have a specification first, that we can have other reference implementations? I think there's one right now, which is what, BTCD, as being an example within the Bitcoin space. What about Ethereum?
So Ethereum, I'd argue our philosophy is fundamentally different. The spec isn't in code, the spec is in English.
The spec is in English?
Yeah.
And why did you do that?
Basically because I think if the spec is an implementation, then developers of that implementation become the new point of centralization.
Okay. And I remember a quote from you that software that doesn't evolve dies. Or
Well, no, the specific quote is, software that is finished is software that's dead.
Okay. So this point with open systems is they're challenged, they're in a very adversarial environment. At least right now, Ethereum, you've got $1 billion bounty. With Bitcoin, I think it's over $6.5 billion now. And there are people actively trying to bring the system down. And that forces a kind of evolutionary mode where you've got lots of eyeballs trying to find bugs, trying to find the thing, which makes this, again, the difference between open and closed. Now, one of the things that open systems, and again, the comparison between intranets and the internet, which is, some of the discussion about permission ledgers or closed ledgers versus open ledgers, is this point about interoperability. Now, in order for all these different separate innovations, all these companies innovating, using blockchain as a platform, how are they going to interoperate between private permission ledgers and open public ledgers? Is that even a sensible discussion to have?
So one interesting project that actually got launched on top of Ethereum today is called BTC Relay.
Today?
So this is basically a smart contract inside of Ethereum, which is a Bitcoin-like client. It verifies Bitcoin transactions. It verifies that Bitcoin transactions have been confirmed. And actually, by Blockstream's own definition, which is, if you quote their paper, it's a sidechain that validates data from other blockchains. We've basically literally launched the first ever production sidechain.
This is today.
Yeah, so point there is that very practical experiments and just cross-chain interoperability. You can have applications, something like a CrowdStrike that launches tokens on Ethereum, but you can pay to it in Bitcoin. And potentially that kind of model can be expanded like between any chains. You can do, between some public chain and some consortium chain, between two consortium chains, between Bitcoin and a consortium chain.
So, Gavin, could you have predicted this 3 or 4 years ago? Or what was the vision back then?
That there'd be interoperating like stuff happening on blockchains.
Right. There wasn't a concept of just blockchain, right? It was just Bitcoin.
It was just Bitcoin. And well, I mean, the network effect for money is really strong. So I think the world kind of wants there to be one money. It remains to be seen whether Bitcoin is that one digital money that the world wants. I still tell people, don't invest your life savings in Bitcoin. It may not turn out to be the world's money. But you should hold a little bit because it might be. And so it surprised me how many different monies there are right now. There are hundreds of alternatives to Bitcoin. Ethereum being the second biggest right now. It doesn't surprise me that the technology exists to like move currency between them, to validate currency on different blockchains. I won't be at all surprised if a lot of the ideas from other blockchains go into Bitcoin and ideas from Bitcoin go into other currencies. All of that is part of having an open system where innovation can be borrowed from anywhere. And that's fantastic. And that's why all of these monies are better than the kind of traditional fiat monies we have, which are very closed and highly controlled.
No, programmable money is really cool.
So, we had this sort of preamble before the session, which was, right now it's kind of ironic that we're beginning a multi-day session with this open blockchains, because if you look down, you would think that a lot of the interest is with sort of these private blockchains. I don't quite know what they are. There are some other alternatives in terms of technologies which might be interesting to look at. I think certificate transparency, Neha and I have talked about as a different kind of model, which may have those very interesting characteristics. But these characteristics, as far as openness, again, means that these systems are open for adaptation, open to innovate, and open to evolve. The question is the rate.
I wanted to throw a couple things in there. As far as the specification being in the code, I just wanted to clarify that in Bitcoin Core we actually do want to have a specification that is in English. The problem is that natural language tends to be a little ambiguous, and it's really hard to get something defined very, very strictly. And even like subtle misinterpretations or slight variances in that could result in incompatibilities. So as far as like an authoritative description of what the rules are, if you do it in code, at least you know that rigorously like that's what it's supposed to do, or that's what's defined.
You get close.
We want to get close to making it like very, very like not dependent on a particular implementation. I mean, that would be ideal. I think that in Ethereum, that's been done a lot due to the collaboration between these different teams that have been building, working on in different programming languages to do implementations, and there's a lot of communication there. If we have that kind of communication, it is possible for us to be able to make sure that we all agree that the rules are what the rules say in English. And then as far as like the multi-chain stuff, to change topic back to what we were talking about, we were actually really excited about the idea of being able to have smart contracts that can operate on multiple chains. And so this is something where even if two different chains have different rules, one approaches with the sidechain thing, but even with like off-chain contracts that we can do where you could redeem these contracts on different chains. That's something that's really promising, and I think that one of the problems that we've been having with exploring these different areas of that we could do with different coins is it's a very divergent process. It's really hard for people to take different innovations from different blockchains and kind of merge them together. It'd be really nice to have a more layered kind of architecture where we can have some validation at a base level and then allow for innovation on top of that does not necessarily require changes to the consensus rules themselves. Either with like the script itself or with other ways that execution environments where these different contracts can run and have a way of making sure that that the results is what everyone ends up agreeing on, which is what's really what the blockchain is enforcing.
Okay, so before we move into questions, what can we learn from other systems like the internet? Like we have within the internet world, we have standards development organizations like the IETF, the W3C. what has the blockchain technical community done in terms of either onboarding new engineers, looking at other standards development groups to get more engineers involved? I mean, what's the status of
I
development?
will first of all say I think we're slightly conflating two issues here.
Okay.
One of them is increasing the amount of developer talent, which is an important problem. The other is ensuring consensus on protocol upgrades, which is also an important problem. So, I mean, I think the first is just a kind of education problem that's just going to have to be sort of solved over time by the community, and hopefully we can work together on making development tools easier, continuing to work on education. Regarding the second problem, it's kind of, I think, unique also because of the specific sort of cultural constraints that we have around, being really concerned about being decentralized, being also concerned about things like censorship resistance. So, like with basically, a lot of people are not going to be happy if, if there exists an official Ethereum standards body and the board of directors is like controlled by, 5 major software companies. So that's like, to some degree, you can't really force a model from the top down because I think, as I've said earlier, the constraints are fundamentally different. This is something that we haven't really seen before. And like I think the approach that we're going through currently, which is sort of evolving things crisis by crisis, may even be the best we can do.
Right. There was an article in CoinDesk where we pointed to, again, some of the capture issues, I guess, with existing bodies. This concept of decentralized governance or decentralized administration, isn't the word decentralized, what do we mean when we talk about decentralized? I mean, is that really a meaningful concept if we're trying to actually implement it? Does it mean global? Does it mean those who participate? Why bother with decentralized?
I would argue the way that you would measure decentralization is basically a difficulty of collusion.
And couldn't we use the blockchain technologies to do our own governance?
If you're talking about like creating some kind of DAO in order to approve protocol changes, quite possibly. Although then the second challenge is that like, what do you want the rules of that DAO to be? Is a community that can't decide if the block size should be 1.6 megabytes or 2 megabytes going to agree on what the rules are going to be? Then do you even want a process where DAO can agree on what the rules are unilaterally independent of, let's say, the users assenting to it? So, there's this case that was, like, to some degree, if you look at Bitcoin particularly, to some degree, arguably, it has a kind of sort of multi-cameral governance model where the first chamber is the development team, the second chamber is like for the 5 to 10 miners in China. And, there have been a few blog posts saying that basically hard forks are good precisely because they don't put that much power in this sort of second chamber of a few miners, and sometimes you might want to make changes that are good for the community but bad for them.
One interesting thing that I noticed in the last year is the power of getting people together to actually talk.
Yeah.
There was a great quote which was, angry programmers can't code, right? And we have lots of drama over the last year, lots of emotion, at least within the Bitcoin space. So I think the same time as the consensus last year, there was Scaling Bitcoin in Montreal. We got everyone together, if you remember, face-to-face, irrespective, it's a human process, to people coming down together, trying to even harmonize the vocabulary. What do you mean by X? What do you mean by Y? When we moved it to Hong Kong, as you know, we had the Mandarin issue, which is how do you translate the 51% attack into Mandarin? Now, this is a global phenomenon. So what I would like to do now is, again, open up to the questions. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. I'll start one with an easy one, which is open to any of the panelists here. Is anonymity worth sacrificing for convenience?
Sometimes.
Sometimes. That's like the engineering answer, which is it depends. Right?
Well, yeah, it's how much convenience are you giving up for how much anonymity?
Right.
All right? I mean,
Well, as long as you're able to choose how much you're willing to give up of your own privacy, I think that the problem is that it's kind of in black and white, and a lot of these kinds of environments, it's either like you are completely anonymous, or you have to reveal everything about yourself, or you have to give information that might not be relevant for a particular use, because just you have to give out all that information. For every single particular use that you might want to have for something, you might want to, this is more of like an identity management thing where there's certain aspects of your identity you might want to reveal for some convenience. But I think that ultimately it should be the user's choice how much they're willing to give out and, you know, whether it's worth the convenience that they're getting for it.
So, yeah.
I also think, I mean, we need to think about what we're actually getting for anonymity and what is that a proxy for? What is the real value behind it? It's not just anonymity for anonymity's sake. It's things like censorship resistance. It's things like open access, and it's making sure that people are able to have certain kinds of freedoms. And so we need to make sure we think about those and not just a proxy word like anonymity.
So
would-
yeah, go ahead.
I would even argue that if you look at the kinds of systems people are building on top of Ethereum, like privacy is and anonymity in general are definitely not just limited to, let's say, buying stuff that certain powers don't want you to buy. It's even like very simple concerns like making sure that your financial market is not going to be subject to front-running attacks.
Huh. And this morning there was again this characteristic slide of Venice versus open blockchain versus closed, which was closed. You can change things, which is kind of the point about open blockchains being immutable, right? Censorship resistance. It's quite an opposite view. And the question that we have from an anonymous question here is, in keeping with this,
It's convenient for them to
which
submit
is very
that, so-
convenient.
Quick, backtrace the guy's IP address.
No, I can do that. What are the downsides of censorship resistance? What is the downside of immutability?
Well, it certainly makes regulators, or I shouldn't say regulators, I should say law enforcement would rather every transaction have a very clear identity that they can get at. They don't care if anybody else can get at it, that they can get at. That is the system that they would like. I don't think they're going to get that. And I don't think they get that in the real world, in cash transactions and even credit card transactions. If the credit card company is overseas, I don't know what processes they have to get the information.
Well, even overseas, actually, one practical example is, so, like, I remember a couple of months ago, I was going into Mexico and I was taking some money out of some ATM, and that ATM was actually, was able to tell me for that bank account, oh look, I have a balance of something like 2 million pesos, which is worth a lot less because pesos are worth a lot less. And I just realized, wow, so my Canadian bank is actually giving that information to this random thing from Mexico. So it's less than you think, and with closed systems, you don't even know how much less than you think it is.
Right, right. Another question here, which actually riffs off this issue of identity, specifically digital identity, is should digital identity be managed by governments to cover the underprivileged and people who can reuse their identities in multiple areas, for example, healthcare?
So I think, regarding identities, governments being identity providers is a completely legitimate thing. And the other actually interesting Ethereum project that got launched last week is an integration with the Estonian e-residency program. So if you have an e-residency device, then you can make a digital signature with that, and that signature can actually get verified inside of an Ethereum contract, and you can kind of link an address to an identity. But the nice property of that is that number one, it's a voluntary scheme. And number two, I think a good model of identity isn't one that kind of enshrines one specific centralized source, but it's one where you assume at the base level that people have identities, identities can make claims about other identities, and the choice of which kinds of claims from whom to trust should be left to the edge.
Okay. Where can the audience members find more about? I mean, there's a lot of innovation happening almost daily or weekly. Where can people go for information to find more? Eric?
Well, I mean, you can come to the bitcoincore.org website, and I mean, if you want to, as far as information about
Well, my understanding here is that there's a lot of key members in the room. You've got a few of the Bitcoin Core developers. I think there's a fireside chat that you're having. When
yes, we're having a fireside chat tomorrow at 1:30, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So with that, if you want to, what I would like to try and do is keep the the blockchain train on time. Can I just ask each of you to provide a few closing remarks about this issue of open blockchains and how you see things maybe panning out in the next year or two?
I think the future is really bright for open blockchains. I have huge faith in the open process. It's messy, it's chaotic, it's crazy, it's 3 steps forwards and 2 steps back sometimes. But I think it is the best system that we have for innovating. And I think innovating is the key, making things better, making the world better. You ask, how can people keep track of all the innovation that's happening? It's hard because it's open. There is no one source of information that you can go to that will tell you everything. The best sources of information are aggregators like Reddit or some of the news sites that cover Bitcoin. But I can't keep track of everything that's going on just in the Bitcoin world, let alone the Ethereum world and the
Dogecoin world.
Dogecoin world, the old
So there's a business
S3
opportunity.
initiative.
There's just such a Cambrian explosion of innovation.
It is, and that's fantastic, and that's why I'm so optimistic.
I'd say the other thing is that, there are open processes. It's also important to note that there's different kinds of open processes. And in general, I would also say processes that look like market processes, so processes that look like processes where anyone can try their own thing. If people really feel very strongly about different ideas, they can try them all in parallel. Those work better. If you could get away with them, they work much better than political process where you have people kind of fighting over one particular thing. So, if you can have I think anti-fragility really comes not even necessarily at the level of one project, it comes at the level of the entire ecosystem. And, the more people we have, the more, doing different things, then, the more if people do have fundamental values, they can both be satisfied. If people just have different opinions on, what the best way is to do something, and one of them is eventually proven right, then, the more people do different things, the more progress we'll have, and we can learn from each other.
Niha.
I just want to sort of grand experiment, and it remains to be seen how steep the curve is, so how quickly things actually progress. But right now we still are at the beginning, and it's very exciting to see all these different areas coming together. Another reminder that these areas are like very old. The cryptography used in these cryptocurrency systems is not cutting edge, though we're adding more cutting edge features to it. The techniques for reaching consensus are not necessarily brand new. Databases are a really old field, extremely old field. But what is new and what is very exciting is this open access platform and using a market and using rationality and using a currency. And I think that there's a lot of excitement about moving sort of back towards closed or private blockchains, and really, I think if you do that, you're missing the point. You're missing the entire point of this revolution, which is having this sort of platform for people to interact and for innovation to happen. And to do that, it needs to be open.
Yeah, so I really think that this,
Right now, we still are.
application, trying to figure out
Now we still are.
can do this. We really, I think, need to find better ways to collaborate as an industry to kind of figure out standards and figure out, the interoperability requirements and get better communication. I think there's been a lot of, misinformation and like stuff that's been spread that, like a lot of people it's kind of hard to figure out whether a source is good or not. I think we need to do a better job of having the forums where we can really discuss things and figure out, make sure that we're all on the same page. And as far as this open and closed blockchain thing, I think that with open blockchains, really what we're trying to do is incentivize computing. It's like we have this token. It's like we have this for providing. It's like we have this to do this application. It's like we have this to do this for providing work. It's like we have this work. And part of this service can be like validation, making sure that we agree that a particular transaction took place. So this is really something that this is adding. I think that we still need to figure out how we can work. I'm very optimistic that we're going to be able to find more services that we can do that kind of thing for, and really build a more distributed, a more decentralized internet where people can provide services for the network and have ways of trustless incentives for them to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to wrap things up here, one of the things that these face-to-face meetings help with, obviously, communication, trying to come to some kind of collaboration, and hopefully out of that you get an emergent consensus process. So with that, I think we need to wrap up as far as time is concerned. We will be around. Please do grab us. Most of the will be available over the next few days. Gavin, you now have the floor as far as any other few remarks about this morning that you want to make.
Yeah, I'm not surprised I wasn't asked why I'm convinced Craig is Satoshi. I posted on Reddit. He signed in my presence using the private key from block number 1, the very first mined Bitcoin block, on a computer that I'm convinced had not been tampered with, on software I'm convinced that had not been tampered with, a message of my choosing. And so that kind of sealed the deal for me, convincing me that he does have that private key. My interactions with him feel like this is the inventor of Bitcoin. I remind everybody he is human. I'm sure he makes mistakes like we all do. I'm sure he's made some mistakes in the past. And he wants his privacy. So I'm going to draw a line. If you ask me questions about this, I draw the line at, I will explain why I'm convinced. I will not go into like personal details of the discussion that I had with him.
Just to sow a bit of controversy for fun, I'll explain why I think he's probably not Satoshi.
It's 2 minutes. 2 minutes.
I mean, first of all, very simple signaling theory. He had the opportunity to take 2 different paths of proving that he's him. One path would have been to make that exact kind of proof, make a signature from the first Bitcoin block, put the signature out in public, make a very simple 10-line blog post that anyone, including people, including cryptographers like Dan Bonet and Ben Kaminsky and so forth, can verify that it's him, and just post that out there and let the cryptographic community do it. Instead, he's taken this path where he's wrote this big long blog post with 200 lines. It's so confusing that even Dan Kaminsky said it's too confusing, and tried to only show that signature to a few select people, and we're supposed to trust them. So, in general, signaling theory says if you have a good way of proving something and a noisy way of proving something, and you choose the noisy way, then that means chances are it's because you couldn't do the good way in the first place.
Okay. So we'll be around for questions. Just thank you very much for everyone. Just put your hands together.